Hi, everybody. Brianna Whitney here, host of True Crime AZ Live. I'm so glad you're joining us tonight. We've got a lot in store, big cases around the country, but also a big sit-down interview here in Arizona about the most recent serial killer case and conviction in this state. Behind-the-scenes evidence, never before heard, details on this case with the county attorney. So we have a lot there that's coming up later in the show. But if you were with us last week, you know this show is recorded a couple hours before you guys are watching it live on YouTube. Typically, I'm with you guys live so I can answer your questions. We're recording for a couple weeks while we work on some equipment back here, but I am still with you guys live. I am in the chat right here below if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, so I can answer all of your questions live just like usual, just in a little bit of a different way. So it's kind of cool I get to be in the audience with you as we go through this show tonight. But I'm excited that you're with us, and I want to get into some of the big cases we're talking about. So let's start with segment one tonight, the true crime headlines. Okay, so we now know the suspect accused of murdering Ohio dentist Spencer Tepe and his wife Monique is this man on your screen, Michael McKee. This is the ex-husband of Monique Tepe. So here is what we know about the case right now. This was obviously shocking to everybody. These two, this couple, the Tepes, were killed inside their home in Columbus, Ohio at the very end of December, found dead inside, their 4- and 1-year-old kids alive, unharmed inside, but in this crime scene until friends and police were able to find them. So here's what we know about Michael McKee. He was married to Monique several years ago. They got divorced about 8 years ago. They were only married for about a year and a half. And there were some issues in the marriage, obviously, as to why they got divorced. They had listed incompatibility on the court documents, but Spencer's brother-in-law, Rob Misla, has been talking to some media outlets, including NBC News, and he told them that there was some emotional abuse towards Monique in that marriage, and that when they found out that the Tepes were murdered, they almost immediately believed that Michael McKee could be involved. Well, evidence has now led detectives to McKee. We know he's now facing 2 counts of premeditated aggravated murder for both Monique and Spencer. We also know that he's also in the medical profession. He was listed as a vascular surgeon in Rockford, Illinois. He was a Chicago resident as well. And so, you know, now the premeditation has to come from the fact that authorities were able to link his car to the area of the murders right before the Tepes were killed and leaving the area right after. Premeditation, of course, the fact that he was going to have to get from Illinois to Ohio to commit these murders. Now, when Monique was married to Michael, they had no kids together. So it's very bizarre. We don't know what a motive is so far. Police are not saying what the motive was, other than it's a domestic and targeted attack. The problem, though, is nobody knew of anything recent. Even the family has not said there were any recent instances that they knew of Michael threatening or anything like that. What might have been in the past with his history with Monique, it didn't seem like there was any specific instance recently that anybody has noted of, at least not publicly. Obviously, the police are looking into this as much as they can. Yesterday, the police chief and the mayor in Columbus, Ohio, gave a press conference kind of detailing what they could, at least publicly, about what led them to Michael McKee as a suspect to be able to charge him with 2 counts of premeditated aggravated murder and where the investigation stands. They were rather tight-lipped, but they did talk about not only the car, but also more about this case. I want to show you video because if you were watching our show last week, we talked about the Ohio murder, and you saw this video of a person of interest walking in the area that police released. They were hooded, they were in that jacket, so you can't see a whole lot. What we don't know is if that person in that video is Michael McKee or not. Police are not revealing yet if that was him or if that video helped lead to his arrest. The mayor, though, did go on to say that a lot of tips came in, and it was the tips that were crucial in making an arrest in these murders. But I want to play some sound for you from yesterday, the chief of police in Columbus, Ohio, detailing how they got to Michael McKee exactly and what evidence they're using to go forward with the prosecution.
We believe at this point we have the person responsible for the murders of Monique and Spencer Tepe in custody, and that person is Michael McKee. This is still an active and ongoing investigation. Detectives are still going through evidence, tips, and videos. We can't speak to all the specific details related to this case, so we don't want to jeopardize the ultimate goal of conviction. But what we can say, this was a targeted attack. This was a domestic violence related attack. As we know, McKee is the ex-husband of Monique Tepe. We can say that we have the suspect's vehicle on neighborhood video surveillance arriving just before the murders and leaving shortly after. Detectives were able to link this vehicle to McKee. The vehicle was located in Rockford, Illinois, and evidence was found that showed McKee in possession of the vehicle before and after the homicides. We can also say that multiple weapons were taken from the property of McKee, and there is a preliminary link from our NIBIN to one of the weapons that ties it to the homicides.
Now, you heard her refer to a preliminary link from their NIBIN to one of the weapons. Just to explain what NIBIN is, that's basically ballistic testing. So ballistics matched one of the weapons that they found inside of Michael McKee's home. So you've got the gun weapon evidence, and then you've got the vehicle evidence. I'll be curious if they are able to link any DNA, if there's more GPS data that they're not telling us yet, that would only bolster and strengthen their case even more. But again, why now? Why would her ex-husband choose to nearly a decade later carry this out? Was it jealousy? Was there some sort of correspondence or communication between the Tepes and Michael McKee? We don't know, and that part of the story is still missing. Of course, we're going to stay on top of this, one of the biggest true crime cases in the country right now, and I know a lot of people hoping that they get to justice for the Tepes as soon as possible. Let's turn to another big true crime case. This is the Luigi Mangione case. So many people, their favorite suspected killer. We're going to talk about the status of his case tonight. Our second true crime headline tonight, the case of Luigi Mangione, the man accused of shooting and killing United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson back in December of 2024. So many people paying attention to this case, and it is honestly pretty confusing, which is why I wanted to break down the updates this week and where it all stands. What makes this so confusing is that Luigi Mangione is facing charges both federally and statewide in New York and also Pennsylvania. So there's 3 different cases, 2 state cases and 1 federal case, which makes this extra confusing. So I want to talk about the big update this week, which is in his federal case. So the judge has now changed her mind on a new evidentiary hearing, and this all comes down to what Luigi Mangione had with him in what you're seeing right here in his backpack in McDonald's when he was arrested for the crime. It all goes to whether or not the police were correct in how they searched and seized that backpack, and also if he was read his Miranda rights before he was arrested and questioned there in the McDonald's. So let's talk about the federal case. The judge this week changed her mind on how this case would go forward. She is now going to hold a short hearing in the next 2 weeks on procedures that the police said allowed them to search and seize that backpack the way that they did when he was caught at the McDonald's. Now, this judge originally had said that this was going to be unnecessary, that there wasn't another hearing that was necessary for this, but she's now gone back on her word and basically said, because the charges are so serious in this case, the federal case holding the possible death penalty part of this whole thing, she's going to go through and re-look at this because she's listened to counsel on both sides. Now, she wants to hear about the procedures, what was standardized protocol for searching and seizing something in a case like this. So she says she doesn't actually need to hear from the officers who conducted this in the McDonald's. She needs to hear from an experienced officer or officers who can detail what the actual policy and standardized procedures are and that were in place at the time of this. So this should happen here in the next couple weeks, and then she should make a decision of some sort in the federal case. That's the one he faces that death penalty charge in or possible sentence in. He does not face that in the state case. So you were following the Luigi case late last year. We were covering it on this show. And the reason for that was because in December, he was also in court for a hearing that was supposed to last a couple days. Well, turns out that lasted nearly 3 weeks, which is completely unheard of. That is in the state case. They are similar in what the defense team is arguing in both of them. but a little bit different in how they're going about it. So what happened in the December hearing that we thought we might have a decision on is that his defense team is trying to exclude the evidence that the police seized from inside his backpack at that time in McDonald's. That included the alleged murder weapon, notebook, and writings that were allegedly detailing what he was going to do in the attack, writings that kind of surrounded this insurance situation, his thoughts on it, etc. So that hearing, again, supposed to last a couple days, ended up lasting 3 weeks. I mean, it was almost like a mini trial for Luigi Mangione in December. And it all is about whether or not it was legal for the police to search and seize those items in the backpack, and also if those police officers read him his Miranda rights before they started questioning him and before they took him into custody. That judge did not make any immediate decision on that, so much so that it's actually going to be about half a year before the judge makes a decision. What we know now is he said he will make a decision at the next court date for Luigi in the state case, which is in May. So we likely won't hear about whether or not that evidence is going to be admissible or not until late spring going into summer. And that's the next time that we should see Luigi Mangione in a state court in person. So we'll learn more about that as we go on. We'll stay on top of the federal case as well. One thing I found interesting in just my research in the Luigi Mangione whole case and situation, his defense team said there is so much overwhelming interest in his case that they actually started their own defense team online website to keep everybody up to date. That includes all the court dates, what the attorneys are saying, their reactions to the hearings as they go forward. This is something that we typically don't ever see in a case, but there are so many people who are invested in this that they've actually started this to try to keep the public up to date, even in between those hearings that we see publicly on the news, on media, on YouTube, etc. The very top of that website, Luigi has his own statement that he's given his attorneys, basically saying he is so overwhelmed by the mail that he's received in prison that he can't respond to everybody, but he would like to, and that every single piece of mail he receives, he does open and he reads it. And so a lot of people have been looking at that and kind of latching onto that. As many people who believe that he deserves a stiff sentence for what he did, there is a lot of people in this country who are also part of this Free Luigi movement. They believe he's either innocent or was kind of a martyr in what would be health insurance woes in this country. So it is very interesting how this is playing out. Again, federal and state unfolding at the same time. We should see him in person again in court in May, and we'll learn more as we go on in both of those cases. Coming up after the break, our big sit-down interview with the Maricopa County attorney here in Arizona about our most recent serial killer case. She's going in depth about everything, behind the scenes evidence, the victims, the pieces of evidence, video we've never seen before. And she lets me question her about why they didn't prosecute a possible 9th victim in this case and why it took so long for these victims' families to see justice in this case. That's coming up next. All right, our big segment tonight, the interview with the Maricopa County attorney. So many people are interested in serial killer cases. I obviously am one of them, but people in the true crime community, we hear a lot about them back in the day, right? Serial killers from the 70s, 80s, 90s, even maybe early 2000s. But you don't hear about them as much now because there's so much different technology. It's hard to be a serial killer. DNA, surveillance, GPS, location, all of that has changed a lot. But in Arizona, about 8 years ago, is one of the most recent serial killer cases, and it's the case of Cleophus Cooksey. Here's what you need to know about this case before we get into the interview. For about 3 weeks between November and December of 2017, Cleophus Cooksey went on a serial killer shooting spree, killing at least 8 people, these 8 victims, but possibly 9. Here's a look at the victims. And the thing here is that none of them are related, and we lack a motive in any of these killings. The woman, Maria, at the bottom that he stalked at an apartment complex was also sexually assaulted. His last killings, his mom and his stepdad at their home. Now, it took more than 8 years for this case to go to trial. That is an absurdly long time for a case to get from point A to point B through conviction. And to that end, the trial itself took 7 months. So you can imagine the agony that the victims' families have felt for so long. But it turns out that the county attorney agrees on all of this. She shares a lot of the frustration, and she gives us some reasons as to why. Cooksey was convicted of all 8 deaths, but he was not sentenced to death for all of them, only 6 of them. The jury could not decide on his mom and his stepdad. So that is undecided, and that is up to County Attorney Rachel Mitchell. She is ready to make a decision on that. She is sharing that with us exclusively and all about this case, going into some in-depth evidence, video evidence, sharing some thoughts on Cleophus Cooksey's childhood, what we need to do to be better in the justice system here, and everything you would want to know about a serial killer case in Arizona. So this is my interview, sit-down interview with Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell. I'm going to rewind a little bit for Cleophus Cooksey. Obviously, this happened over 8 to 9 years ago. Mm-hmm. When this first happened, you were not county attorney.
Right.
But you were working in the office.
Yes, I've been in the office for 30 years, but I wasn't in that particular area at the time. So,
were you aware of that crime when it happened?
Yeah, I mean, cases like this stand out, certainly, where you have that many people who are murdered. Serial killer, they absolutely stand out in everybody's mind in this office.
So that was about a 3-week period in 2017 when he was acting. Mm-hmm. Convicted of 8 deaths, suspected of 9. Mm-hmm. How does somebody pull that off in this day and age with technology, and with surveillance and location and GPS? How was he able to do that?
You know, I think one of the things that you have to look at in this case is why. You know, most homicides have maybe a strong why, if you will, or a connection of some sort. But when it's this random, this scattered in the sense of the types of victims and that type of thing, that does make it hard for the police to, I mean, you can have cell phone data, for example, showing where somebody might be located, but you have to have somebody that you are looking at first. And that's the difficult part of this.
That's an unusual serial killer. Usually they all have an MO and maybe the same kind of motive, protocol. Not him.
You know, it kind of reminds me of the snipers that we had back, 10 or 12 years ago. I'm trying to remember what year exactly that was, where it does seem fairly random.
Is there any motive for any one of these victims? They're all pretty unrelated. Maybe his mom and stepdad would have more of a motive than anybody else, but do we know, was there a burglary or robbery motive? Was there a connection, relationship motive with any one of these victims?
Well, we know the one victim, there was a potential sexual assault, or at least an attempted sexual assault. So to the extent that that's certainly a motive, but it's the connection that's the puzzle. So it's not really strongly known why these people, why then, etc.
And he never revealed more information himself.
We don't really have much more than, I know you sat through the trial. I mean, that was
about it.
That was the extent of it.
He was convicted for all 8 deaths in this, but only given the death penalty for 6 of the 8. Those last 2, his mom and his stepdad.
Right.
Have you talked to the jury? Why couldn't they come to a decision on those 2 deaths?
Well, I've talked to the attorneys who tried the case, and, those, of course, were the last in time, and he was caught immediately thereafter. And I think because of the state of mind that he was in when he was caught, is maybe what caused a question for at least one or two jurors. But the others, obviously, they felt very strongly about in the other 6 cases where they did give the death penalty.
What was the difference between the state of mind and those other crimes versus where he was at when the mom was killed?
For example, when he kidnapped the young woman, you don't see somebody who is, obviously having some sort of psychotic break or psychosis or that type of thing. You see a very calm, almost eerily calm interaction between the two of them as she walks around her vehicle and gets in the other side. Very different than when he was caught the last time. Still may not be a defense actually to the mindset, but it may have given them pause on the ultimate punishment as far as the death penalty.
So technically those last 2 deaths are a mistrial in terms of the penalty phase, right?
In terms of the penalty phase, yes. I mean, they still stand as far as convictions and that the aggravators were found. As you know, and I'm sure most of your listeners know, there's 3 phases to a trial. And so the first 2 phases stand.
Obviously, he's already been sentenced to death for 6 of the crimes, but technically, it's your choice whether to go forward with retrying.
Correct.
For the mom and the stepdad. Do you have a decision on that?
I have made a decision not to go forward with that. We've talked to the family. Obviously, there are resources and time that go into retrying a case, even though the first 2 parts of the trial still stand. When you're trying the death penalty portion of it, the sentencing portion of it to a jury, it's a brand new jury who hasn't heard a lot of the facts. And so it's not just a matter of, putting it before them and saying, should this person receive the death penalty? There's a little bit, you have to retry some of the facts so that they understand the whole situation. And so based on that, it did not seem like a efficient use of resources to me to proceed with the other 2 death penalty cases.
And so will that just default technically to life in prison?
Right. He will be sentenced to natural life in prison on both of those.
And you talked to the family on that?
My attorneys have reached out to them, yes.
Your attorneys, their conversation with the family since this whole trial, do you know what that's been like? What the family has said, how they feel? I mean, it's been a long time, and then to kind of get the ultimate punishment here at the end, it's got to be emotional.
I haven't been present for those conversations, but I mean, I can tell you, having handled cases myself, I mean, to finally have that stamp of this is not okay, and society recognizes it's not okay. One thing about prosecution, you could never, in these types of cases, achieve perfect justice because the person is still gone. Or if they're alive and they've been violated, that violation has still occurred. But just to have society say, this is not okay, and we're going to hold this person accountable, and this person's never going to do that again, is a relief to so many victims.
There were several odd instances with Cooksey's victims that happened. For example, 2 victims were in that first hit, but that second hit, the 3rd victim, he took that victim's gun and then used that gun for the other killings.
Right.
Was that at all considered a motive in that specific killing?
I don't know if that was a motive or if it was just opportunistic on his part, but obviously that gun was used to tie the subsequent killings together, and so it was a crucial piece of evidence for us.
Had he not used that victim's gun, was there a chance they would have never made that connection?
I mean, it certainly was helpful in making the connection. I have a lot of faith in the police that they would have solved this, but obviously when they're using that gun, that really did help.
Another piece of evidence was a necklace that he was wearing, I believe at the time he was arrested. Mm-hmm. That belonged to another victim?
Yes.
Do we know who, and was that piece of jewelry a possible motive?
Is it a possible motive? Yeah, it might be a possible motive. There was some discussion I heard, was it a trophy or anything like that? I don't know that it was a trophy for him so much as it is opportunistic. This person had a necklace, I want it, I'm going to wear it. It could have been as simple as that.
So that necklace belonged to the same person he stole the gun from?
Right.
Possibly super opportunistic with Salim specifically.
Could be, yeah.
And he was wearing it at the time he was arrested?
He was wearing it at the time he was arrested.
He had car keys of a victim.
Yes.
Whose were those? Maria's. And that's the woman that he was stalking around the parking garage?
Yeah, the parking lot of an apartment complex.
Maria's an interesting part of this case. She was the one that was sexually assaulted. Do you know if they had any prior knowledge of each other, or did he just simply sit there, surveil the parking lot, and choose her?
You know, if you watch the video, what you'll see is him moving throughout that apartment complex, almost casually in some ways. And then at some point you see her pull up into a parking space, and he goes up alongside the driver's side, and there's an exchange. It's a little bit hard to see because the camera's on the other side, the passenger side of the vehicle. You see her walk around to the to the passenger side and get in, and it doesn't seem like there's any sort of connection there. It just, he approaches, and tragedy comes from that.
And we don't know what was said in that exchange.
No, there's no audio. Or that picks up on that.
Right. And only the two that know are Maria and...
Right. Whether he threatened her, whether he had a ruse.
Police also suspected Cooksey of killing a ninth person.
Yes.
His ex-girlfriend's brother.
Yes.
But your office chose not to go forward with prosecution.
Right.
Why was that?
Well, there were a number of things. And keep in mind, we can always go back on that if there's additional evidence, because there is, as you know, no statute of limitations on homicide. However, there had been some moving by witnesses of evidence, and that created some issues. And sometimes, and I can speak to this just as somebody who's tried cases, where you have a weaker case or it's a more complicated situation that actually may interfere with just the clean presentation of other cases. And so when you have something like that, you don't want to have that dominate, the issues with that case dominate to the point where, the attention is taken away from the 8 solid cases that you do have.
Witnesses moved evidence?
Witnesses, there was some interference with some of the evidence.
Can you talk about what that was?
I won't talk too much about that because, obviously that is not pending, but it could be revisited.
There are, to my knowledge, no other suspects in that crime. Is it a situation where you do believe he did that, but there's not enough evidence to prosecute?
We don't believe that there's enough evidence to go forward at this time.
But do you think he did it?
As a prosecutor, I totally deal with whether there's evidence to go forward or whether there's not.
That's fair, and I can respect that answer. I think it's very hard to be a serial killer today, and I think it is shocking that we actually had one in recent times like this, to this extent. Do you think that even in this day and age, pulling off what he was even able to 8+ years ago is not possible?
Oh, I would never say it's not possible. I mean, you have, one thing I've learned is good people cannot necessarily stop bad people from doing bad things. And if they're determined enough, you always have to be wary.
Yeah. There was a lot of time between these crimes committed and the trial. Some would say a concerning amount of time between.
Yes.
Why was it so delayed?
This is a frustration that I've had much of my career about how long cases take to go to trial. And throughout my career, it has gotten increasingly longer. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think some that are correctable, some that are not. One of the things that makes cases take longer now is it's very different prosecuting now than it was, for example, when I started back in the 90s.
Really?
Oh, hugely different. I mean, in the 90s, as you know, I'm a sex crimes prosecutor for 25 years. You would have a police report, you would have recordings of your main witnesses, the victim, the accused, maybe if somebody saw something happen, you would have a medical doctor. You may have DNA. Back in the 90s, DNA was newer. But now you have digital evidence, and that is a huge game changer, both in a positive way and in a negative way. The positive way is obvious. You get video or cell phone, exchanges. The negative way is it is a massive amount of information that has to be dealt with. So for example, body-worn cameras, good thing, yes, but also it's something that has to be reviewed in real time by somebody in this office. And if there's any sort of information that can't go out because of victims' rights, for example, it has to be redacted. That is an enormous undertaking, especially in a homicide, because you have how many police officers involved in so many body-worn cams. You have security cameras that have proliferated in our society. You have cell phone data that has proliferated in our society. And so you have massive quantities of information that can be helpful, but you also have to review. That was one of the things that we were trying to convey, frankly, in the Gilbert Goons case, where, I stood in this very room and did several press conferences where I said, there's 600 pieces of media here. And what people don't understand is, as a prosecutor, you have to review all that, because before you go to the grand jury, you have to know the good and the bad, because you have to present both to that grand jury. So it takes a long time. That's one reason. But there are other reasons as well, and that is, for example, in death penalty cases, we're seeing a lot of, I'll say, bending over backwards. I absolutely believe in giving people due process in death penalty cases, but there are some situations where a person is given attorney after attorney after attorney, and then that just delays by years sometimes. By that time, the second or third attorney gets caught up to speed, and it's because of a variety of reasons that they're given new attorneys. There is a unwillingness to hold people's feet to the fire in terms of discovery and following the deadlines for the rules of discovery, and that's dragged out cases. So it's frustrating that this takes 8 years to go to trial.
How much of that you just listed can you or your office fix?
Well, we do try to object when there are continuances, or when somebody has not provided us discovery mitigation, for example, in a timely manner. But it's ultimately up to the court. So you can voice your objection, but it is up to the court to decide. And it's a tough call for courts, and I recognize that, because they have to weigh and balance the defendant's rights, which of course they should have,
right,
with needing to get this going and looking at victims' rights. Because think of being next of kin in one of these cases and just hanging on for years, in some cases over a decade, and
Awful.
That's just the conviction. That's not the sentence.
Right. I mean, and you've often heard people in this state say that they feel like the justice system helps out sometimes the defendant more than the victim.
Absolutely. And, when I became county attorney in 2022, I attended the first execution I had gone to, and that was in November of 22. So at that time, I'm trying to do math real quick here, I was 55 years old. That crime, because I'm an Arizona native, had happened when I was 13 years old. So I was still in grade school. And here I am, the county attorney, attending the execution. That's outrageous.
That is outrageous. And to your point, not even just the conviction of these crimes taking forever, but so does putting people to death here in the execution rate itself.
Exactly.
Is that all part of the same problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's once there's a conviction, it's really not about discovery rules and new attorneys. It's really about the appellate process. But yes, I mean, it can be very, very lengthy. And to the extent that people are saying, well, the death penalty is not as effective, well, some of that's because of the delay. It's a very deliberate attempt to drag out the death penalty so that it does lose some of its effectiveness. It's still a deterrent. But, when there's that much delay to where many people alive weren't even alive when the crime happened, or they were 13 years old.
It's a real possibility that Cleophus Cooksey could be on death row for 20 plus years before he's executed in this state.
That's very true.
I mean, yeah, that does.
With 6 death penalty sentences. 6.
Does that almost even lengthen the time he could possibly appeal for, given that there's multiple death penalty sentences as opposed to one?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you have, more convictions, I suppose that could make it longer.
That's ironic, though.
Yeah. I mean, we just had Mr. Jerf executed, and that was from the early 90s, and he was executed in 2025. He killed 4 people. Now, that was out of one incident where he killed a family.
Right.
But
you even had Jerf telling me, that he deserved that fate, and it still took that long.
Well, and he pled to try to avoid the death penalty, so you didn't even have all the trial issues. So, I mean, at some point, it just becomes ridiculous.
Well, Cleophus Cooksey is kind of part of even a larger issue, just from the delay of justice from start to finish of execution.
Right.
Do you see that getting fixed anytime soon?
I know there is talk about it at the Superior Court level to try to force earlier settlement conferences, but really that's not going to fix the death penalty process, because the settlement conference is really to get the mitigation out there to see if a different result should happen. We always try to get that mitigation up front, because I'm the one that makes the call on whether we pursue the death penalty.
Yeah.
And I want as much information as possible before I make that call. And so we'll even extend the time. Obviously, the defense has to agree to that, so that I can have additional time to consider the mitigation before I make that decision. So I think this is the goal of the 2-year settlement conference is to do that. But it really doesn't speed up the death penalty process when it's appropriate. When somebody has killed 8 people, a 2-year settlement conference is not going to make that difference, probably.
So why is it different in Arizona than maybe another state who would act sooner or has acted sooner in other cases?
I think, some of the states just are very hardcore on enforcing deadlines.
Interesting. You said something that resonated, the digital evidence. And I was thinking, do you foresee AI taking away some of that burden of review that takes so long, that delays the process nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, AI is moving certainly in that way, where AI can be used to summarize things, do transcripts, for example, even summarize videos. That's going to be a process, and that's going to have to be looked at very carefully, because we can't rely on it and then it be wrong, So
right.
It's going to be a process. I do see it as being helpful in the long run.
When you said the digital evidence part, it's funny, because from my end, I've always thought that DNA has made the biggest difference between, let's say, the 90s to now. But maybe DNA has made the biggest difference on the investigative side, the actual making the arrest, making the match.
Right.
But do you think digital evidence has actually played the biggest difference on the trial side of things, the court process, the actual legalities?
I think that has made a greater impact in terms of how much evidence there is, how much you have to comb through in preparing a case. DNA, of course, is still the gold standard in terms of proving identity. So, yeah, I mean, they've both been very impactful.
I know you've met with prosecutors and learned a little bit about Cooksey's background, his childhood. Was there things in that helps when you're looking at almost like a criminal profiling of somebody like this?
I'll answer that more generically. I mean, it's not surprising when you see somebody who is, committing outrageous crimes, murders, sexual assaults, to see something in their background that does lend itself to, maybe seeing where this came from a little bit. But also, I don't want to take away from the fact that these people make choices. For example, and this is a big bone that I had to pick as a sex crimes prosecutor. Everybody thinks that sex offenders were sexually abused as children. And the reason for that is because when they're getting sentenced to get sympathy or leniency, they'll say I was sexually abused as a child. But the research actually shows that that's not true. The majority of sex offenders were not sexually abused as a child. The majority will claim it, but when you put them on polygraph, it turns out that probably the better part of half of them are lying about that. That doesn't mean that something didn't happen in their childhood, but more often than not, it's something related to child physical abuse or witnessing domestic violence. So it's, while it might be interesting that there's something in the background, the research doesn't always say that there's a one-for-one correlation that when this happens, this happens. And the reason I have such a bone to pick about that is because think of the reverse. Victims who hear that, well, sex offenders were all sexually abused as children, victims worry that they'll become offenders. And throughout my career, I have dealt with victims who have not wanted to be public about their victimization because they're afraid that people will think that they're now dangerous. And that's a horrible, horrible burden that they carry. And the relief that I've seen when I say that's actually not what the research shows. The research shows that, first of all, the vast majority of victims will never become an offender.
Yeah.
Because they have the empathy. They know what it did to them. But it's also just not true that a lot of offenders were sexually abused as children.
Do you think empathy is the biggest character trait lacking in a killer, an attacker, somebody who assaults somebody, and a serial killer?
Well, you can have different motives for somebody attacking somebody. You can have rage. You can have, some sort
Revenge.
Revenge type of situation. But certainly empathy is a big one.
So outside of any sexual abuse, what did you learn about Cooksey and his background and his childhood?
Well, keep in mind a lot of this is coming from the defense, so they also can present evidence and of childhood abuse or neglect, substance abuse in the family. A lot of the things that I see when I'm considering whether to seek the death penalty or not, really stem from a lot of the adverse childhood experiences, sort of genre of situations where you have criminality in other parts of the family, you have mental health issues in other parts of the family, substance abuse, of course, neglect, childhood physical abuse, traumatic experiences as a child. So those are some of the common ones that you see, as well as maybe evidence of mental illness in the person, him or herself.
Did Cooksey fit multiple of those?
They did present evidence related to some of that, yes.
Which one did you find to be the most effective in terms of learning about him that may have been something that would have affected him most in his adult life to go on to do this?
I look at the whole package when I'm making the decision. Again, I look at what they've experienced, but I also don't want to take away from the fact that these individuals have made a choice. And this isn't just a choice. This was 8 people who are dead, potentially 9, but 8 people who are dead, and needlessly. So nothing that outweighed that aggravation. So as you know, we call them aggravating and mitigating factors. Nothing that came together that outweighed the aggravation, and obviously the jury felt the same way, at least in 6 of the cases.
Would you characterize him as making an evil choice?
Oh, taking the life of another, yes.
Yeah. What was the hardest part about prosecuting this case with the amount of victims and the amount of evidence and having to link it all together? What ended up being the most challenging for your office to get these convictions?
Obviously just the longevity. Capital attorneys are extremely good. There's so much litigation, meaning there are so many motions filed, in terms of all the different types of evidence that they have to get in, keeping the case joined so that the jury could see the full timeline of events. Because as you know, as we talked about, there's a gun that links all but one of the cases together. So it's really important to keep the cases together so that the jury can have the full picture. That doesn't always happen, actually.
It doesn't.
And so I really applaud them for doing a great job on that. Just presenting it in a cohesive way so that the jury can follow a lot of evidence and paring it down to, a timeline, so critical.
Oh yeah, especially with something like that.
Trial skills, cannot be understated.
What sticks out to you most about this trial?
Well, I mean, obviously, just the question mark in terms of why, why them, why then, just the why.
Do you think we'll ever learn that?
I don't know. Sometimes you don't. I think that's probably what makes this a case of interest to so many people is I think people like that complete total package, that complete picture. And sometimes, you have it and sometimes you don't. I mean, we were talking obviously before we went on camera about this surgeon that just chose to kill his ex-wife and her husband after how many years where they've been apart and with the children in the house. Why? Why then? It just, I guess it makes sense to them in a weird way, but it certainly doesn't make sense to the rest of us.
Well, and it's interesting because I think when these crimes happen like this, people in the public most want the why. Mm-hmm. But it's not necessary for a first-degree murder conviction, right? You don't have to prove motive.
Motive's not, no, it's not. And, I've gone to a lot of training by, for example, some of the people at the behavioral sciences group with the FBI, the profilers.
Yeah.
And, sometimes, what I've learned from them is serial killers, for example, they have their own standards, but they're standards that you and I, if we sat here for 100 years, would not guess. I know, for example, Ted Bundy, who's obviously a very well-known serial killer. I remember one of the profilers talking about everybody thought that, well, he liked victims that had long, straight hair with a part down the middle. Well, it was the 70s and 80s, or I think it was in the 80s as well. That's how everybody wore their hair back then. That wasn't the standard. The standard was, who he thought was worthy for him to do this to. What does that mean? How could we figure that out? I prosecuted a serial rapist one time who chose his victims because they had clean cars. And his thought process in that was, if they take care of their cars and they have clean inside their cars, they probably take care of themselves, so he was less likely to catch sexually transmitted infection. Now, you and I would never figure that out.
No. So you think each serial killer kind of has their own pattern and strategy that goes to whatever their desires or interests or fetishes even maybe are.
Yeah, just a very, cognitive distortions as well, just these thinking errors that normal people don't have.
We don't know that with Cooksey.
Don't know.
And that is frustrating.
It is. It is. I mean, we know that even when people are in and out of consciousness, they'll fill in the blanks because there is just a human desire to fill in the blanks. And there are blanks.
I mean,
doesn't mean there's no questions in terms of did he do it, but there are blanks as to getting to the bottom of that.
I mean, I would argue that is part of why you and I do what we each do.
Yeah.
We want to get to the bottom of something and understand it and fully be able to look at that from start to finish and say, this is why and how, and this is what happened because of it.
Right. But like I said, with the serial rapist, if he hadn't told us I pick women with clean cars, we would never have figured that out, ever.
What can we learn most from the Cooksey case?
That's a tough one. I mean, I don't want to sound fatalistic, but I mean, there is just, there are bad people in this world, unfortunately. It's not necessarily because a victim has done something unwise. I think a lot of times in crimes, people look at, well, what did the victim do? And the reality is, they didn't do anything. They didn't do anything wrong. They were just at the wrong place, at the wrong time. And bad people do bad things. It's hard to predict. It's hard to have a crystal ball about, and it's tragic. I wish I could.
Yeah. And you guys can only do so much when you get a case like this.
Yeah, I hate being in a reactive stance. I like being on a proactive stance, but sometimes when you have something that is this nonsensical,
Nonsensical and prolific.
yeah, unrelenting.
Unrelenting, that's a good word. I
Yeah.
haven't heard that in a long time. Is there anything else you think we should know about Cooksey, or anything else that you want to share about the case and the prosecution of it?
Well, I really, really appreciate the job that my attorneys did. You know, I am the face of this office, but I got to tell you, I have great people that work in this office, and they are equally unrelenting in their effort for justice for victims, and I really appreciate that. These are not hard. These are not easy cases. These are hard cases. They take a lot of time. They take a lot of just fortitude to just power through, and they're exhausting. And they did a great job.
Our thanks to Rachel Mitchell for sitting down with me, explaining all of that. I found it so fascinating, and I really enjoy those sit-down interviews, getting to get to the nitty-gritty of a case like that. And I know sometimes we have to wait until it's adjudicated like this, but it is fascinating to learn more. I also should note that I've reached out to Cleophus Cooksey in prison now that he's been moved, asking to share his side. I have not heard back yet, but as soon as I do, if I do, we'll bring you the very latest on that. Thank you so much to everybody for watching True Crime AZ Live tonight. I'm excited to bring you these shows every week, and we'll see you again next week. Good night.